The movie commences with Scott Huffman, a political aide working for the Pentagon, finding himself stuck in heavy traffic while on his way to the hospital with his wife and son for a checkup. Just as Scott receives a call, his assistant informs him of a high-ranking official's sudden resignation. Understanding the urgency, Mrs. Huffman allows her husband to take the metro to work. Upon arriving at the Pentagon, Scott's secretary immediately briefs him on the day's plans. One of the tasks awaiting him is a meeting with Master Sergeant Thomas Tully. Scott's colleague and friend Stanton assigns him the responsibility of investigating a posthumous request for a Medal of Honor for William Pitsenbarger and resolving it promptly. After reviewing the documents, Scott informs Tully that William has already been awarded the Air Force Cross. However, Tully argues that William deserves the Medal of Honor, the highest military honor. Following the meeting, Tully follows Secretary Peters to the restroom to discuss the case further. Scott, on the other hand, feels that he doesn't have much time to devote to the Medal of Honor request, as he sees no personal gain from such laborious work. Secretary Peters, however, has different plans. He calls Scott into his office, authorizes him to gather combat testimonials personally, and requests a comprehensive examination of decorations. Scott immerses himself in the Pitsenbarger case and eventually leaves town as he realizes he doesn't have many alternatives. The story then takes us back to the height of the Vietnam War, where a company of troops finds themselves ambushed during an unexpected patrol in the dense forest. A fierce firefight erupts, and as casualties mount, the soldiers radio for an evacuation of the injured. However, the process is slow, as the soldiers below are unfamiliar with loading the litter onto the rescue helicopter. The delay occurs because the first person to be evacuated is the medic, the only one trained in this task. To expedite the process, William Pitsenbarger volunteers to descend and assist. In the present, Scott visits the Pitsenbarger residence accompanied by Master Sergeant Tully. He interviews Frank, William's father, to hear his side of the story. After a brief conversation, Frank advises Scott to speak with the surviving members of Charlie Company's 16th Infantry, also known as the Big Red One, to uncover the truth about the situation in Abene. He recommends starting with Lieutenant Billy Takota, who was present during the incident. Scott travels to a rural area an hour away from the Pitsenbarger home in search of Takota. He ventures deep into the forest, following the flow of a river, and calls out for him. To Scott's surprise, Takota appears on a boulder, motioning for him to approach. It turns out that the veteran was fishing with his grandkids. Before they begin their conversation, Scott takes out an audio recorder, but the old veteran snatches it from his hand and throws it into the river. Takota then opens up about how the encounter in Abene made him question his previous love for the rush of war. Another flashback takes us to the past, where a young Takota carries a wounded soldier to safety, but gets shot in the back as their Vietnamese counterparts eliminate them one by one. Many soldiers perish during the ordeal. Takota calls for assistance and reports the situation over the radio. At that moment, Takota spots William emerging from the helicopter and, despite the intense gunfire, he takes charge of evacuating the wounded. Returning to the river, Takota reveals that he was the one who suggested William be awarded the Medal of Honor. When a comrade asked about the conflict, Takota simply pointed to the painful gunshot wounds on his back. Scott continues his efforts to locate the other members of Charlie Company. He arrives at Jimmy Burr's house, where he is greeted by Jimmy's wife, Donna, who informs him that Jimmy doesn't wake up until 8 in the evening. Donna explains that her husband suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and experiences 50 other war-related effects from Vietnam. Jimmy's sleep patterns are disrupted, causing him to be awake at night and asleep during the day. While waiting for Jimmy, Scott asks Donna for the list of men from Charlie Company that she has kept track of over the years. Exhausted, Scott falls asleep in his car while waiting. Later, Jimmy approaches the car to wake him up and, in a tense encounter, fires his gun to demonstrate that it is loaded. Jimmy reveals that he served for 10 years without firing a single shot until Vietnam, a haunting memory from the past. During their conversation, Jimmy recalls a moment when he and another soldier were talking while patrolling the dense forest in Abene, and Lieutenant Takota scolded them to stay vigilant. Shortly after, the Viet Cong launched their ambush. Jimmy uses his shotgun to kill an enemy combatant, but the sight of the entrails hanging out of the enemy corpses causes him to become nauseous. Scott will soon return to the Pentagon. He consults his secretary about the requirements for reviewing a congressional decoration package. The first requirement is a fresh eyewitness account, followed by the Department of Defense casualty report. The endorsements from the chain of command are the final step. While Scott possesses the first two requirements, he is unable to determine the status of the last one, the approval from the chain of command. Later, Scott meets with another Charlie Company veteran named Ray Mott at a firing range. Ray explains that shooting helps him maintain his sanity and proceeds to share his side of the story. Ray reveals that William, being part of the Air Force, shouldn't have been in the situation, but he chose to stay and fight alongside strangers. As they continue their discussion, Ray mentions that hundreds of enemy fighters were crawling on the ground and up the tree trees during the ambush that Charlie Company faced. Ray realized at that moment that they were set up and had no chance of winning. The narrative unfolds with Scott informing Stanton about the misplaced command endorsement file while they are engrossed in a game of basketball. Scott then pays a visit to the Pitsenbargers to gain a deeper understanding of William. They spend time watching a few films, after which William's parents share their perspective on when William decided to join the service. The atmosphere becomes emotionally charged when Frank ascends to William's old room and begins to express his share of regrets. By the time Scott returns home, he finds himself transformed. He ponders over how a man like William, who seemingly had everything, could leave home with such unwavering conviction that no bullet could deter him from his path. Meanwhile, Dakota struggles with insomnia and starts to reminisce. During the Vietnam War, troops began to loot the bodies of fallen soldiers. Fully aware that they are surrounded, Dakota instructs his soldiers to feign death and starts piling dead bodies on top of them. Later, William calls out to anyone nearby to check for survivors. Jimmy responds. Urged by William, Jimmy assists him in carrying Dakota to safety. Despite being hit in the shoulders, the brave airman manages to rescue the lieutenant and tend to his wounds. In the middle of the night, Dakota attempts to call Frank but is unable to speak. Instead, he grabs his car keys and sets off to visit William's grave. Back at the Pentagon, Stanton approaches Scott with news of his upcoming promotional interview. However, Scott is hesitant, wanting to complete the Pitsenbarger report first. During Thanksgiving, the Pitsenbargers pay a visit to Scott and his family. Later, Dakota also visits Scott. The veteran hands Scott a new audio recorder and presses the record button. Dakota then confesses that he made a critical error when he radioed for artillery support. He admits that he miscalculated the distance correction, leading to a friendly fire that killed several U.S. soldiers. This 22-second mistake has haunted him for years. Scott continues to review the audio recordings of his interview to further investigate the command endorsement that was filed 32 years ago. One name consistently emerges: Keir, Sergeant John Keir. Left with no other options, Scott decides to visit the man in Vietnam. He embarks on a journey deep into Vietnam's stunning countryside, eventually arriving at Keir's humble forest home. Keir reveals that although he wasn't religious, William Pitsenbarger was the answer to his prayers for a miracle during the Abini encounter. Despite the chaotic situation, William remained calm and assisted Keir, who was severely injured. Keir further reveals that Mad M. Holt, the company's CO, was the one who initiated Operation Abilene. Colonel Holt, now known as Senator Holt, is a powerful figure who could potentially be appointed Secretary of Defense one day. Keir gives Scott a tour of the area, where he currently earns a living by helping veterans who wish to dwell in the past, transforming their negative memories into positive ones. Keir then shows Scott a beautiful greenhouse filled with vibrant flowers and butterflies. It turns out that the conservatory was the exact location where William Pitsenbarger descended during Abilene. Overwhelmed, Scott sheds tears and experiences a profound spiritual awakening of acceptance. During Operation Abilene, the U.S. grunts found themselves surrounded. After tending to Ray's injuries, William hands him a letter, instructing him to send it to someone if he doesn't make it. William then removes his jacket and covers Ray with dead bodies. The brave airman continues to search for soldiers to help, but is shot multiple times in the process, resulting in his instant death. A few days later, Scott breaks into Stanton's office and discovers the endorsement from the chain of command he has been seeking, shedding light on the entire plot. Stanton had intentionally withheld the recommendation letter out of fear that it would expose Operation Abilene during one of the bloodiest periods of the Vietnam War. This revelation could potentially tarnish the senator's reputation. Stanton had assigned Scott the task, believing that Scott wouldn't take such a menial task seriously and that it was his responsibility to protect the senator from scandals that his political rivals might exploit. After deciding to retain the data and incorporate them into his research, Scott is threatened by Stanton, who vows to ruin his career. The day of Scott's promotional interview arrives. During the interview, Scott appears unenthusiastic. He has no desire for a promotion unless he completes what he started. Scott intentionally sabotages the interview so that he can continue with William's Medal of Honor recommendation. That evening, Scott meets with Tully and shares his share of trauma. He tries to help Tully by encouraging the veteran to confront the pent-up emotions he couldn't express to anyone else. Initially, Tully reacts defensively, but soon breaks down. Tully confesses that he was relieved that it wasn't him who died, and that he felt ashamed for feeling that way. The following day, Tully and Scott pay an unannounced visit to Senator Holt at the country club. Despite the surprise, the senator welcomes them, and Scott fills him in on the details of what happened. The senator admits that he doesn't know how the recommendation fell through the cracks. There could be various reasons, but he promises to address it in Congress. The senator tries to persuade everyone present to award William the posthumous Congressional Medal of Honor for his bravery during the Vietnam War. However, the opposition shuts down Senator Holt, and the chairman closes the case. Scott returns home defeated and shares the details with his wife, but his wife encourages him to take a leap of faith. Later, Scott Scott meets with Secretary Peters to report his findings and decides to go public with the story. Peters warns Scott that he will be treading in deep waters, but regardless, Peters will support him. Scott goes live on television and accuses the senators and staff of playing political football with military valor, attracting nationwide attention. A few months later, the president signed the bill allowing the late William Pitsenbarger's posthumous award. Soon, everyone involved in the war, including veterans, attends the award ceremony. Ray returns the letter that William gave him to its rightful owner. 32 years ago, William's parents received the Congressional Medal of Honor from Secretary Peters. Shortly after, as the film draws to a close, the secretary thanks the Operation Abilene veterans for their years of dedication in making this day possible. The older men rise to their feet. The secretary also demands that everyone impacted by one man's actions, including veterans of the conflict and the Williams Unit pair of rescues, speak up. Following the ceremony, Frank gives Scott his son's watch and bids him farewell. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our video. Watch the next recaps on the screen and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.